The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, Jesus said to the crowds of the Jews, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, How can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever feeds on me, he also will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the bread that the fathers ate and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
It was only around 3 or 4 years that there was a survey done in the United States. Of course, it was meant for church-going Catholics in the whole of United States. And there were a number of questions because they wanted to see where Catholicism is or where our Catholics are in terms of so many different moral and ethical issues and also matters of faith. So in that survey, there was one question: do you believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist? Do you really believe that Jesus comes alive in this bread and in this wine? Of course, I don't think there has been any study of that nature in Sri Lanka, but in countries like US, they try to study everything, and so therefore, this was done. And the result was that almost 65% of Catholics who go to church, now mind you, when you have 65% of church-going Catholics, it's not those who do not go, because in any country in the world, if there are 100 Catholics, they say only 25 people will go to church every Sunday. So this result is referring to the 25% of the church-going population. And out of that, 65, that's those who take part in the liturgy of the Eucharist, they said they find it difficult to believe in the real presence of Christ on the altar. I'm not going to ask you whether you believe in the real presence or not, but that was the study. Now, when you take that finding about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, my dear friends, it's no strange experience for people of God. Because when you try to study the Old Testament, especially in terms of the evolution of the idea of the Eucharist, the main experience of the people of Israel was the experience of moving from their slavery experience in Egypt and coming out to their freedom land or land of freedom. And when they were moving through the leadership of Moses, because the first reading today refers to the experience of Moses himself, because having brought them back to their experience of liberation, Moses is now talking to the people. Now, when you try to understand who Moses was, of course, son of a Jewish woman, but then he was a murderer living in Egypt because that's the kind of man he was. There were no leaders to take the leadership for that the people of Israel could move to their liberation. So God chose Moses to be their leader. And we do know when Moses started bringing the people, people started complaining, though in fact they were in a journey for freedom, because this is what happens to people. Human beings, we all love to live on the surface of things, never go to the deeper aspects of life. So Moses had this problem of having no food for the people. And it is in that experience of Moses that God gave them manna to feed them. For what? God gave them manna so that they move on together as a community and they find their freedom and be nourished by God's granting of food to them. But then, what Moses says in this text today is that, referring to that journey, he says, very important to highlight this saying in the first reading, where he says, take care lest you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know. That's the key, because they were, as a people, as a community, they were moving from an experience of slavery and they were moving for freedom. And Moses was their leader. God was behind them, above them. But they did not know that they were being fed by God. So, lack of faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is no wonder. Even the people of Israel were fed by God through manna, which is the foreshadowing of the experience of the Eucharist. But they did not know. They did not understand. Now, why is it that we find it difficult to understand the mystery of Eucharist? In order to dissect this problem, my dear friends, we all have to draw from the Jewish mysticism, which is the mother faith of Christianity. Judaism is the beginning and the origin of Christianity. Now, in Judaic faith, they strongly believe in the presence of the soul of every human person. What they say is that we all have a body, which is what they call nephesh in Hebrew language, which they say we have hands and feet. This is our body. But this body has deep within itself something that we do not fully understand, which is there, which we know we have, but you cannot explain it. And then in Judaism, they say, deep within ourselves is the presence of a spirit, which in Hebrew language is called Ruah. The breath of God is in all of us. So in Judaic faith, there is nothing that is physical which does not have a non-physical dimension, my dear friends. This is something we as Christians have not absorbed so much in our faith. But if you go to the Judaic faith, which Jesus also was living with, he believed in the presence of the soul, that is the inner, deeper presence of the divine within. He believes, and he wants us to believe, that there is a soul, and that soul needs God's nourishment. So manna was a nourishment for the body and the soul, and the Eucharist is also nourishment for the body and the soul. But then people did not understand manna, which was food for them, and we don't understand the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Why? Because we don't live from the depth of our souls. Now, one can wonder, what is this? Living from the depth of the soul. What does that mean? There is a famous Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Friedman. You can watch him on internet or on YouTube or in Facebook. He explains that in Judaic faith, all human beings have to live from the depth of their soul more than from their bodies. Now, for example, I was watching once how he explains this. He calls two people from the audience, and it was fairly senior husband and a wife. And he asked them, how long have you been together? They said, 35 years. How long did you know before your marriage? 5 years. So you've been together for 40 years. Well and good. But then he told the couple in the presence of all the others, I ask you a few questions. Can you answer them? They said yes. And what are these questions on? About you, each other. And the first question he asked the husband, can you tell all of us the color that your husband or your wife does not like at all? And both of them said, no. We know the color that he or she likes, but we have no idea what the color that he or she does not like at all. So he says, after 40 years of life together, you don't know what the color that each one does not like? Then he asks the second question. Now you have been together for 40 years. I'm sure you have listened to each other. Let me ask another question. What is the most painful experience of your man and your woman before they were 10 years? They both said, we don't know. What is the happiest experience of your spouse between 10 years and 25 years? We do not know. Anyway, I'm not going to ask any of you the same questions. You answer it yourself. Then what he said, here is what has happened to us. We all live on the surface of our human bodies. We are together for 40 years. We eat and drink. We travel together. We have everything together in life as man and woman. But we do not know the soul of the other person. The soulfulness of human relationships. That is why, my dear friends, even in the Old Testament, the reading of the teachings on marriage, you find that in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where God says, a man shall leave his father and mother, and they shall be one. This oneness that the Bible speaks about, the author of the book of Genesis speaks about, is not about the oneness of two bodies, but oneness of two souls. In order for two souls to become one, they need to know the souls of each other, and the souls can become one over a period of time. If the bodies can become one, there cannot be any divorces and separations and problems in marriage. So therefore, my dear friends, the Eucharist, in the first instance, as we discussed this in the first reading, is that it is nourishment for all of us who believe in God to nourish ourselves, our souls, for a journey of souls in this life. And that is why Eucharist is a community meal. Eucharist is for those who live together, those who share life together, those who have the same faith, same journeying together in the world, wherever they are. That's why we have Eucharistic communities. A Eucharistic community is a community that lives together. And that is why, my dear friends, in the history of the church, in the first 3 centuries, the understanding of the real presence of Christ was not in the Eucharist, it was in the community. And the mystical presence was in the Eucharist. And over a period of time, the church changed its teaching. So now the mystical presence is in the people, and the real presence is in the Eucharist. How it has changed, because when you become an organization, when the liturgy is held and celebrated at this formal level of a liturgy of the Eucharist, the community is lost. And that is why when you go to different parts of the world, especially in the Western world, when you have the Eucharist in the morning on Sundays, everyone goes to a hall for sharing of a piece of cake and a cup of coffee. Why? The meal which is given to the souls of each and every individual is to be lived in the community that you live in. And of course, in Sri Lanka, you have a Eucharist, and everybody says hello to the priest. And after 10 years, after 10 weeks, 10 minutes, you don't find a soul in the church. You know, the community is gone. So therefore, the Eucharist, the real presence of Christ, is only for those who have that consciousness of God's presence within my soul, which needs that nourishment, and also it's for the community that is striving together, living together, so that we may experience the presence of Christ in our day-to-day life. That's what is highlighted in the second reading, where Paul says we are one body, and in that body there is the food, which is the Eucharist, which is the food for one body that strives together to live according to certain values that God has given to us. And that is why, my dear friends, in the gospel passage today, Jesus is talking about those who eat my bread and drink my blood will live forever. That is, our souls will live forever. In the Jewish faith, my dear friends, we are more body, more spirits, more souls than our bodies. If you live in the depth of your soul, if you have this openness of each other, even in your relationships, and if you have that inner life of oneness, Eucharist becomes a nourishing food for all of us. So that is why St. Augustine says, the food that you eat, you will be one day. It is only for those who know what it means to live from the depth of your soul that Eucharist becomes a nourishing experience. And for those people, it will be powerful. It will be a transforming experience. It will be a nourishing experience for those who thirst and hunger from within their souls. Food, my dear friends, become important when you are hungry. When you don't have hunger, food is irrelevant. When you don't have thirst, drinking is irrelevant. So the question is, let us ask ourselves, do I hunger for eternal values? Do I hunger for life within my soul? Do I thirst for drinks for my own thirst, for spiritual, deeper meaningfulness of life? For those, Eucharist is a nourishing food. So therefore, my dear friends, as we celebrate the feast at the body and blood of Christ, let us always be conscious to awaken our souls, the deeper dimension of our lives, to deeper desires for eternity, oneness, compassion that we all do have deep within.